Now, someone who has been one of the most important voices throughout Israel's genocide, in terms of so many aspects, the historical context, the insight. I know a lot of you follow him on social media for that reason, is Zachary, who is a brilliant historian who has actually, we'll talk about this, you've been traveling around Palestine as of late. It's great to see you again, by the way.
Likewise, Owen. Thanks so much for having me.
It's such an honor, honestly. I just want to start. Kind of weave this in a bit. We'll talk a bit about, because you've just come back. You were there, I know, for about a month or so. I just want to start with Smotrich, who is the finance minister in Israel. We call him, he's often portrayed, as a kind of far-right minister, as though Netanyahu's relative moderate, or others are. It's true he uses particularly extreme genocidal rhetoric, although there's a kind of bogeyman approach, isn't there, to the Israeli state, where it's big bad Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, so that's the issue. But nonetheless, he has just announced that thousands of homes will be built, illegal settler homes in the West Bank, which is, of course, illegally occupied. And he said, we will bury a Palestinian state. Europe will have nothing to recognize. He's referring there to the growing wave of recognition of a Palestinian state by various European nations. I just want to what's your kind of take on this?
Well, the Israeli government has been in a process of annexing the West Bank for many years now, going back before October 7, 2023. The Israeli organization Peace Now, kind of a liberal Zionist organization that hopes to bring an end to Israel's occupation of Gaza and the West Bank, published a report already in July 2023 that Israel had effectively annexed the West Bank, in the sense that it had transferred over the duties, the responsibilities, the administration of the settlement apparatus, the settler apparatus, from the army to Bezalel Smotrich, who was finance minister. In other words, they put the authority of West Bank settlements under civilian Israeli control rather than Israeli military control. And that is effectively a form of annexation. In the year prior to October 7th, Israel had killed something like over 200 Palestinians in the West Bank. In the immediate weeks after October 7th, Israeli settlers, backed by the Israeli military, ethnically cleansed dozens upon dozens of Palestinian communities in the West Bank, primarily in Area C of the West Bank. Wherever you go in the West Bank, there are active attempts by Israeli settlers who are backed by the Israeli military to ethnically cleanse Palestinians. Some 1,800 Palestinians in the South Hebron Hills in Masafar Yatta were ethnically cleansed. These are Palestinians who, by the way, made a film about the settlers who are intimidating them and murdering them and trying to evict them and force them out of their homes. It was called No Other Land, and it won an Oscar. It won an award. And what happened since those Palestinians, together with Israelis, made that a documentary? You had a Palestinian in that community, a beloved Palestinian, who was murdered on camera just a week ago. And what happened to the murderer? He was let free within 24 hours. And what happened to the families of the victims? They were arrested and imprisoned for having committed the crime of witnessing a murder on camera. And then the Israeli government refused to release the body, forcing those Palestinians to go on a hunger strike just to have the Israeli army release the body of a Palestinian murdered on camera, whose murderer is at large, at free, roaming the West Bank, probably going to kill someone else. This is the state of affairs for the West Bank right now. Ongoing annexation, regular settler violence backed by the Israeli military, ongoing attempts to push Palestinians out of their homes, destroy more Palestinian property, more Palestinian olive groves, confiscate more land, and expand the Israeli settlement enterprise.
What was just being there, in terms of, lots of people, of course, have seen what's been happening in the West Bank. It has, in so many ways, been eclipsed, obviously, by the genocidal depravity of Gaza, but we should never forget what's going on in the West Bank. And for the reasons you just set out, even knowing what you know, were you shocked by what you saw?
The West Bank is a piece of Swiss cheese where every single year, the holes in the Swiss cheese are getting larger and larger. Those holes being Israeli settlement construction, new Israeli-only roads called apartheid roads, expansion of the wall, new Israeli settlement construction, new Israeli military outposts. So those holes, which are the Israeli settlements, are getting bigger and bigger, and the Palestinian regions where Palestinians are allowed to build and grow are getting smaller and smaller. You drive from Ramallah to Nablus, which I did probably a half dozen times over the past month. There's one road. You cannot go more than 2 or 3 minutes driving on that road without seeing an Israeli outpost, Israeli soldiers standing on the street, directing bulldozers, directing construction, a new Israeli outpost. You see settlers standing along the highway. You see new Israeli outposts everywhere. And then there was at least twice where you just, all of a sudden, you're driving along the road. There's just a flashing checkpoint, a roadblock. Oh, so instead of driving an extra 5 minutes on the main road, you got to take a 2-hour detour. And that happened twice. And that's just standard protocol, standard operating procedure. It is impossible to plan any type of trip in the West Bank from Ramallah to Nablus, from Nablus to Jenin, from Anin to Jenin, from Burqin to Jenin. Wherever you go, it doesn't really matter. You will face obstacles. You will face roadblocks. You will be forced to drive on these dirt roads, on side roads, because the main roads are constantly blockaded. And then you never know if a checkpoint will take an hour to get through or 6 hours to get through. So that's the basic nature of trying to move around the West Bank. When I was in Tulkarem, we saw Israeli armored personnel characters and Israeli tanks driving through the streets of Tulkarem. This is Area A of the West Bank, the area that Palestinians are supposed to have nominal control over. It's just a fiction. The Israeli military is operating openly everywhere in Area A. They've taken over the Jenin, Tulkarem, and Nur Shams refugee camps, and they've expelled something like 45,000 Palestinians from those camps. I've spoken to many of them. They were violently uprooted from their homes in December and January 2024, 2025. Many of them described to me cases where Israeli soldiers banged through their doors in the middle of the night, forced them out, again, separating men from women, harassing, intimidating, and physically assaulting the men, and then sending them off in the middle of the night. It's 3 a.m. Like, figure out what to do. And they've been expelled for 6, 7, 8 months, living with family, living with friends, living in the open air, some of them who have no shelter at all. It's catastrophic. And that's why it's fair to call what is happening in the West Bank a second or third or fourth Nakba. We are witnessing the wholesale ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. And it's happening piecemeal, and it's starting with the refugee camps, and it's starting with Palestinian shepherding communities in Area C, but now it's encroaching on Areas B in places like Sebastia, and in places like around Jerusalem. And eventually, and it's happening in areas A, as we said, in the refugee camps. It's happening everywhere in the West Bank, wherever you go. And what we're witnessing effectively is another Nakba in the West Bank.
Yeah, some have called it a slow motion Gaza.
That's another great way of describing it. I mean, what distinguishes Gaza from the West Bank? What distinguishes Israel's actions in Gaza? Well, first of all, its use of aerial power. It's dropping of 500, 1,000, 2,000 pound bombs on the West Bank. By the way, it's been doing that as well over the past year. This would have been unheard of even 2 or 3 years ago, even at a time when Israel was dramatically expanding its settler enterprise in the West Bank. But now you have Israeli forces dropping bombs. You had a bomb dropped in Tulkarem maybe 6, 8 months ago. They've done that in Jenin as well. And they're applying the Gaza strategy to the West Bank. And what do I mean by the Gaza strategy? In the 2000s and the 1990s, you could say Israel adopted a strategy in which it applied mass disproportionate force. This was the Israeli military doctrine for decades and decades. It was, if you kill one Israeli, we'll kill 100 Palestinians. But that has shifted now. That was the old Israeli doctrine. The new Israeli doctrine is scorched earth. A complete and utter annihilation of every structure, every school, every home, every road. They've gone through the camps in Jenin, tearing up every road, destroying all the water infrastructure. So if you were a Palestinian in Jenin, this is before they expelled them all. So now they're gone. But between July 2024 and January 2025, they had torn up the water infrastructure. You didn't have running water in the camps. So it's a scorched earth policy, the mass destruction of everything. And the goal ultimately of these operations in the camps is to eradicate even the idea of a Palestinian refugee. Why are they going after the camps so intensively? It's not because of militant resistance. There is no. Where's their militant resistance in the West Bank? When was the last time you saw an armed attack coming from the Jenin Brigade or the Lion's Den in Nablus? I mean, these groups have been decimated, and that's what everyone told me. There's basically no more armed resistance in the West Bank. That's not what these operations are about.
It's quite a salutary lesson, isn't it, to those who say it would all be over in Gaza if Hamas laid down their arms, notwithstanding the fact that Israel has said we will remove all Palestinians from Gaza no matter what Hamas do. That we can see from the West Bank, where Hamas is obviously not in power, what they're doing.
That's exactly correct. There is virtually no more armed resistance left in the West Bank, but that hasn't stopped Israel's creeping annexation and continued violence directed towards Palestinian civilians in the West Bank. They are, like I said, carrying out daily raids, night raids. They are arresting dozens of people every day, every week. The number of Palestinians who have been arrested and are now sitting in Israel's torture dungeons, again, from the West Bank, leaving aside Gaza, right? From the West Bank, numbers, I think the most recent data point I saw was over 10,000 total, most of whom are from the West Bank. What have they done? They've done nothing. These are people who are arrested without charge. They cannot present a legal defense because they haven't been charged with anything. And they're arrested, and their detention, which can last 4 months, 6 months, is potentially renewable indefinitely. That makes them hostages. And by the way, they're subject to the most dehumanizing conditions that any prisoners have ever been subject to in all of human history. They're bound by their hands and their legs, sometimes for days at a time. They get 1 hour a day where they're allowed to access water. So for 23 hours a day, they have no access to water. 1 hour a day, they get to drink some water. For the rest of the 23 hours a day, they get no access. I had a prisoner a report on Palestine Nexus. So there's like 50 of them in one cell. Okay, a cell that used to have 10 people before October 7th. Now they 5x the number of people per cell. And inside these cells, you get 6 blankets for 50 people. They take turns at night sleeping. Each person gets 2 hours with a blanket. I mean, this is, and then they're starved to death. They come out emaciated after 4 months, 8 months, 12 months, sometimes years behind Israeli bars. Again, for having committed the crime of being born a stateless Palestinian in the West Bank or in Gaza. That's the reality for Palestinians.
I mean, you've been interviewing so many of these families from the camps. What are the things that have really stuck with you?
Look, the basic reality for most of these families, obviously, there's the trauma of being forced out of your home in the middle of the night, being forced to figure out where to live, being forced to witness your family brutalized and assaulted. But then there's beyond the initial trauma, there's having to figure out life again. I mean, we had many. I spoke to Palestinians that have jobs very close to these camps. In Jenin, as well as in Tulkarm, these camps are really located in the city centers of these towns and cities. They're forced out. They wind up in a place like Anin, which is 45 minutes away. How did they get to their job? How did they get to their places of employment? How did they get to their schools, all their family and friends? How did they see them? They're completely isolated. Their cost of living rises dramatically because they don't have access to the same things they had access to in the camps. And people are telling me, look, I have to spend 3 times as much money just getting to work. Now I have to pay rent. In the camps, I had a place. I had an apartment. They're telling me, look, food. I have to drive now 3. I don't have a car. How do I buy bread? I'm 3 kilometers away from the nearest bakery. So the cost of living increases. You have Palestinians crowded. We went to a school that was converted into a shelter for these Palestinian refugees primarily from Jenin and Tulkarm. It's a school you have, and so they take over schools just like they do in Gaza, by the way. So it's the same. They're sheltering wherever they can. So you have a family of 10 people in one schoolroom. It's a small schoolroom, a family of 10 people sheltering. They've taken over dormitories. There's an American university outside Jenin. They've taken over the dormitories. You have a family of 10 people sheltering in a dormitory. It's the size of a closet. You have 10 kids, in a closet. A shower shared between 300 people now. They said, just the basics of life, trying to survive, trying to struggle to survive in the West Bank has become increasingly difficult. We haven't even mentioned the 100,000 Palestinians who were working inside Israel, had work permits to enter Israel before October 7th. All that income's gone. You're talking about layer upon layer upon layer of the increasing encroachment of the settlements, the forced displacements of tens of thousands of Palestinians, the lack of employment, the lack of economic opportunity, the suffocation and struggling of the economy, not to mention political life. Not to mention any type of political action, by the way, is suppressed not by Israel, but by the Palestinian Authority. If you try and protest a genocide, there were protests against a genocide in October 2023. You know who clamped down on that? It wasn't Israel. It was the Palestinian Authority.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to talk to you about Gaza as well. And you've had some really insightful, as ever, points to make, always putting the horrors we're seeing in a broader historical context. Obviously, you're a historian. At the end of last month, the UN-backed IPC stated the worst-case scenario of famine was now enveloping Gaza. Now, what we've seen is an attempt by Israeli propagandists, not least actually aided and abetted by the New York Times, who then brought Netanyahu's outrage on them as, against them anyway, where they had a story about a Palestinian kid who'd starved to death, and they added a correction saying he had a pre-existing condition. And this has become a focus of many of Israel's cheerleaders. Now, you said, in terms of Israel's justification for starving Palestinians to death has been, but they had pre-existing conditions. This logic may sound cruel, but it's part of Zionism's DNA. Zionism is a eugenicist movement. Do you want to explain? What do you mean by that?
I think the most common misconception about Zionism is that the movement was primarily about rescuing Jews from persecution, rescuing Jews from poverty and destitution, and bringing them to Israel, bringing them to Palestine before 48. The reality is much the opposite. It was precisely those Jews, those needy Jews, those Jews who were impoverished and destitute, who faced pogroms in Eastern Europe. It was those Jews who were the first ones rejected by the Zionist movement. Because the Zionist movement, they didn't want needy, impoverished dependents. They didn't want families with lots of needy kids who couldn't work, who had to bear all these burdens of taking care of the elderly and their diseased kids, or their sick children, or their family members who needed extra help. The Zionist movement didn't want those people. That's not how you're going to build a Jewish state in a land of 90% non-Jews. No, to build a state, a Jewish state, in a land of overwhelmingly non-Jews requires force. And if it requires force, that requires able-bodied, physically healthy, not diseased, wealthy Jews with capital, coming from the right professions. And that was the philosophy of the Zionist movement from the 1880s well into the 1950s, even beyond. The first two people in charge of Zionist immigration policy in Palestine, these were Menachem Shenkin and Arthur Rupin, from 1880 until 1914. They rejected 61% of these applicants, these Zionists in Europe who wanted to move to Palestine. They were rejected. And the reason for their rejection, because they were too destitute, they were impoverished, right? And the Zionist movement had no use for these people. Chaim Weizmann, leader of the Zionist movement, said the same thing in 1919, after you had a wave of pogroms in Ukraine, after which hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian Jews were left impoverished. They were left without work. These were the people actually who were desperate to move to Palestine, who wanted a safe haven and who needed a safe haven. Chaim Weizmann said, we can't help you. This movement isn't about saving Jews, needy Jews who have suffered from persecution. No, we want rich, wealthy, able-bodied, physically able Jews who didn't have kids, who didn't have needy dependents. That was the philosophy. And by the way, that philosophy was true even after 48, even after the establishment of the state. When theory, now you have the resources of the state, you have an army, you have help from the United States and the Soviet Union, both countries that recognize your state just minutes after its establishment in May 1948. And even beyond, you have Zionist officials we rejected 300 Tunisian Jews because they were diseased. They had epilepsy and syphilis. And we rejected 500 Jews from Poland. These are Holocaust survivors that were rejected because they were unhealthy and sick.
Astonishing. I mean, we're going to talk about Zionism and where it stood with Jewish people before the Holocaust. But before I do that, I mean, just in terms of more historical context, because something else you've been talking about is about the history of intentional starvation in Palestine and what happened during World War I. And this was the role of the Allied powers, that was the British Empire, the French, and Tsarist Russia. What happened?
This was the last case of mass starvation in Palestine prior to the current case we're witnessing in real time today. In 1914, the Ottoman Empire tragically joins the Germans and the Austro-Hungarian Empire during the war, and this pit them against the British and the French, and eventually the Americans, and the Russians as well. And so, what did the British and the French and the Russians do? They blockaded the eastern Mediterranean coast. They blockaded any ships trying to reach ports in Jaffa, in Haifa. They were blockaded, and in fact, they didn't just blockade the coast. They reached the eastern Mediterranean coastline in November, December 1914. They not only destroyed all the ships currently at port, but then they mined the entire coastline. So you couldn't even. So there were American attempts to actually send aid to Palestine, but they were actually significantly hampered by those Allied war efforts. And so it was a similar starvation campaign. This was a total blockade. Nothing was allowed through. And then, in addition to the many other calamities, and I would say one of the most important of which was the Ottoman attempt and domination of food deliveries, of food supply lines, because most of the grain that fed people in places like Palestine on the eve of World War I was shipped by railway. The largest centers of wheat production in Palestine, Syria, Lebanon were in places like the Hauran, in what is today South Syria. It's a Druze area primarily. And then, of course, in the Galilee, in the north of Palestine, was a very rich area for growing wheat and barley. But the problem was you needed railways to transport that wheat from its places of cultivation to its places of consumption. And the Ottoman Empire completely dominated. They took over all rail traffic. So you couldn't ship any wheat from abroad, and you couldn't ship any wheat domestically inside. So think of the parallels. I mean, the parallels are very striking. It was the outside power. I mean, in the case of Israel and Gaza today, well, it's Israel doing all the blockading. But back in World War I, it was basically the British and the French and the Russians who blockaded wheat coming in from the outside. And then it was the Ottomans that prevented wheat from arriving to where it needed to get to from the inside, from inside the empire. And so there was a mass famine, and you had the estimates vary. 10 to 15% of the population of Greater Syria, so what is today Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, 10 to 15% of the population perished. And it's important to remember that it took a long time for starvation to set in. You had reports of food shortages in the early months of the war, just like we had in Gaza. Right, already in October, I mean, you can go back, October 2023, we have reports of food shortages, right? Because Israel completely shut off Gaza. For a period of about 2 or 3 weeks, no trucks entered Gaza until the Biden admin forced the Israeli government to allow at least some minimal amount of aid in. But basically, you have the same basic setup, right? Where it's outside powers blockading aid. But again, famine is slow to settle in. Our bodies are incredibly resilient. Despite those food shortages in the early months in Gaza in 2023, and despite those food shortages in the early months of the war in 1914, people survived. People are incredibly resilient. They figure out ways of getting food. They figure out a way of surviving one more day. And that's why it took a year and a half before you started seeing mass starvation. Well, guess what? It's taking a year and a half again before you start seeing the reports of mass starvation. But they are coming, and it's not going to stop. People don't realize this. Even if you open up all the borders, you open up all the gates of Gaza today, you have thousands of children that need to be sitting in an ICU unit. It doesn't matter how much wheat enters Gaza tomorrow. They're going to die.
I mean, that's the hideous thing, isn't it? I mean, you get to a point where the body has been starved for so long that without very specialized medical care, you reach a point of no return. So huge numbers of people, particularly children, and obviously as well with children, if you starve them from an early age and they go on to survive, there are dire long-term health complications. I mean, it's so bleak talking about it, but that's the truth.
So we're witnessing what are the cases we're seeing, the 5, 10, 15 people who are being starved to death. At least those are the official counts. Those are the people who die in a hospital. Today, those numbers are obviously dramatic undercounts, right? Because most people, this was obviously the case in 1914. It's obviously the case today. When you're starving to death, you don't have enough energy to get to a hospital. Well, what hospital do you even get to? They've all been destroyed.
Which is why the most accurate measurement, and it's macabre to talk about this because it's such a clinical term, is what, for those many will be familiar with, is excess deaths, which is where you get the 5-year average of deaths and you compare it to then what comes after, and that's obviously absolutely impossible to do in the case of Gaza, because the reporting system has obviously nearly collapsed in terms of the reporting of deaths. The base civilization has been wiped out, as Donald Trump put it. And obviously that, there were still people doing their very best in impossible circumstances. There were doctors, there were nurses, but 1,500 medics plus had been slaughtered. Their hospitals have been ruined. So you're right. I mean, we have literally no idea. We just know the official death count was a massive underestimate. Just because you mentioned there, we talked there about that history, I guess, that relationship between Jewish people and all their diversity and Zionism. And just actually as a kind of preamble, Stephen Pollard, for those who don't know who he is the former editor of the Jewish Chronicle. Now, he was responding to UEFA, who did for the Super Cup, they put out a big banner saying stop killing children, stop killing civilians. Now, I should say they didn't name the perpetrator. So they obviously, that was a cowardly thing to do. Some might think, well, at least they did something. It's a cowardly thing to do to not name the perpetrator, and that didn't save them from being attacked. It caused absolute uproar. Stephen Pollard tweeted, he's a former editor of the Jewish Chronicle, treated as a respectable figure in British society. UEFA statement on the pitch for Super Cup, they might as well have gone the whole way and written, "Fuck you, Jews." That's what he tweeted about it. I mean, there's just a few things. We had for a while, for those who don't know this whole saga involving the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, which was very controversial. The definition itself, fine, but the two of the examples were stifle critiques of Israel. Yeah. But it does make clear that there needs to be a demarcation between Jewish people and Israel. And it's just the way that has been systematically trashed in the least subtle way by people who are cheering on Israel since the genocide has begun. There's no subtlety. Where'd you begin? Where'd you begin with his statement there, for his response? Where'd you begin?
The conflation of anti-Semitism with criticism of Israel, criticism of apartheid, criticism of a genocide is the most insidious attack on the critics of genocide that I can think of, because it's silencing, it intimidates people, they don't speak out as a result of it. I can name off people, and I'm not going to, but I can name multiple people who have told me. I'm always very, very, very careful what I say about Israel and Palestine, because I'm worried that I will be attacked and accused of anti-Semitism. So it's very effective at silencing criticism. It's effective at silencing criticism of the worst crime of our era. This is the crime of crimes. We're witnessing a genocide in real time, and people are and you're weaponizing anti-Semitism. I mean, this is obviously a topic I'm very passionate about as someone who identifies as Jewish and believes very passionately in Judaism, as someone who loves my whole Jewish family, someone who has many Jewish friends, many who grew up in a Jewish community, who still identifies in Jewish spaces and wants to be welcome in Jewish spaces. But I can't, because those Jewish spaces have been, I think, converted into Israel spaces. I mean, that's another topic we could get to. But I mean, the IHR definition of anti-Semitism is a joke. It likens, it says that if you compare Israeli policies to Nazism, Nazi policies, Hitler, that is anti-Semitic. So that would make David Ben-Gurion, the founding father of Zionism, the first prime minister of the state of Israel, well, he's an anti-Semite, because he called Menachem Begin not once or twice, but literally all the time he would liken him to Hitler and the Nazis. Right? You get Avraham Berg, the former chief speaker of the Israeli Knesset. Well, he's an anti-Semite. I mean, we could list you the who's who of the most prominent and most important Zionists in history. They're all anti-Semites.
But that's my point. I suppose it was, hardcore Zionists pushed IRA, thinking those examples would stifle critique of Israel, and one of the examples says that this is an example which should be absolutely unobjectionable, which says holding Jews collectively responsible for actions of the state of Israel as anti-Semitic. I agree, that is anti-Semitic.
Correct.
Stephen Pollard, former editor of the Jewish Chronicle, saw a banner saying "Stop killing children, stop killing civilians," And he says in response to that, they might as well have gone the whole way and written "fuck you, Jews."
I mean, anyone who tells you anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism would be subject to that same criticism. Because if I'm saying being critical of the state of Israel is inherently and necessarily and automatically an attack on all Jews everywhere, well, that's anti-Semitic. Because what?
Yeah, that is because it is anti. I think that's anti-Semitic. I think what he wrote there, he's saying, what if you seeing a sign that objects to killing children and civilians is an attack on Jewish people? I mean, it's just that's anti-Semitic. Surely, it's so crazy.
The people who have been tasked with preventing Jewish hatred, with preventing anti-Semitism, people like the ADL, people like Jonathan Greenblatt, these are the most anti-Semitic people around today, because they were telling you anyone who's thinks Israel should be a state for all its citizens rather than a state for just some of them hates all Jews.
It's actually just applying basic liberal, but I'm not a liberal, but it's just if you apply basic liberal principles, which are supposed to exist, like equal rights for all regardless of their ethnicity, that's extreme in this case.
We've reached a point where it's been weaponized to such an extent that I think increasingly it's actually lost a lot of its vertigo, and people no longer even treat the accusation seriously anymore. I mean, Bassem Youssef just makes fun of it now. He doesn't even take it seriously. Now maybe there are certain people that still take those accusations seriously, but I think what has happened, the weaponization of this accusation has actually, I think, resulted in Jews and not being able to even talk about. I mean, I feel uncomfortable even talking about anti-Semitism. Where is there anti-Semitism in the United States? I mean, of course it exists on the fringes, but does it exist in the Democratic Party? Is there an underrepresented? Do Jews face discrimination as Jews trying to enter Democratic politics? Trying to enter Republican politics? Trying to enter the private sector? Are Jews underrepresented among CEOs of banks? Or tech companies or VCs? I mean, where is their actual, anti-Semitism in the sense that Jews face systematic discrimination in the work. Of course, there are going to be racist people who attack Jews and who carry out anti-Semitic attacks. That's true of every group. It's not just Jews. Obviously, it's Muslims. Obviously, it's Christians as well. It's Buddhists, right? It's Sikhs. There's always going to be hatred-directed one-off attacks. But in terms of systematic discrimination against Jews, where is it?
But do you think, because it's so irresponsible the way they weaponized it, because it stops people being able to label it where it exists, and then you get the kind of spectre of, the ADL or that type going after any form of solidarity with Palestinians, any attempt to oppose hideous crimes committed by Israel as anti-Semitic, and then Elon Musk does a full-blown Nazi salute on stage, or Donald Trump suggests that Jews which don't vote for him are disloyal. That doesn't count. Yeah.
I mean, the ADL, as you correctly pointed out, whitewashed what was obviously a Nazi salute at the same time that it characterizes pro-Palestine anti-genocide protests as inherently anti-Semitic, which is why already before 2023, Wikipedia no longer considered the ADL a legitimate reference in a Wikipedia footnote, because we can no longer rely on ADL data. Because it's just not reliable anymore. If you say an anti-genocide protest is an anti-Semitic protest, well, then your definition of anti-Semitism is inaccurate, and therefore your data is inaccurate, and therefore we have no idea how much anti-Semitism is actually taking place. The people tasked with documenting anti-Semitism are themselves obscuring how much anti-Semitism is actually happening.
Amen. I want to talk to you. You wrote this really brilliant article, The Forgotten History of Jewish Anti-Zionism, at PalestineNexus.com. It's such a fascinating history, which has been intentionally airbrushed and erased. That's the issue. And so much about it I find fascinating. I grew up in a Trotskyist family, and so I used to read, the greats of that period. So I was always very interested in the Bund. In Poland. So I just want to tell us about this kind of history, because obviously today you often hear anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism. Actually, and it's interesting because a close friend of mine was saying, he goes to he went back to his childhood synagogue, and at the end of it they had to do a toast to the king and the IDF, which was interesting, But that obviously is just that attempt to kind of integrate it in the Jewish experience as though that's part of the fabric. That's a new thing in the grand sweep of history.
Yeah, that's correct. Before the 1940s, you were dramatically more likely to be a Zionist if you were anti-Semitic than you were if you were not anti-Semitic. The Bund was a Jewish socialist, Trotskyist workers' political party. It was founded in the Russian Empire in 1897. It was by far the most popular party among Jews up until 1939 throughout the entirety of the Russian Empire, as well as Poland, which included the Pale settlement. We're talking 3, 4, 5, 6 million Jews lived there. We're talking the largest concentration of Jews anywhere in the world. And they were overwhelmingly non-Zionist or anti-Zionist until 1939. I mean, just to give you a sense, I mean, the Bund commanded 55% of the Jewish votes of all the Jewish political parties, so including the Zionist parties, in the municipal council elections in Poland in 1938 and 39. The Zionists got 30%. So they were dramatically more popular than the Zionists. And the reasons were very obvious. The Bund, they fought for free childcare. They fought for workers' rights. They fought for higher wages. They said, we are here. Doikot was the expression that was used in the kind of the mantra of the movement was, no, we're not. The way you fight anti-Semitism is you fight it here on Polish soil, on Russian soil. You don't just cede to the anti-Semites and say, well, you know what, actually, the anti-Semites are kind of onto something. You know, these Jews, they're kind of money grubby, and they're leeches on society, and they're late. All these stereotypes that, by the way, the Zionists internalize about Jews. That's why they're like, oh my God, like we need to create a new Jew. Because the old Jew, the shtetl Jew who liked to study Torah, and who was passive and weak and not very muscular and didn't do sports, that Jew was toxic. So they actually embraced and internalized the negative associations about Jews, which is why they said, no, we need to leave the quote unquote diaspora. We need to move to Palestine, create a new Jew, build a new society of strong, healthy, able-bodied Zionists. Leave behind those weak Jews, those diseased Jews in the diaspora who had leprosy, and so that was a mentality, and most of the Jews rejected that. They said, "What do you mean leave? We're Polish, we're Russian, we're German, we're French. We're not going anywhere. We want to fight for equal rights here." And that was the most popular movement, the Bund, in all of Europe. I mean, including Western Europe. I mean, more Jews were attracted to the Bund than any other political movement throughout the entire interwar period in all of Europe.
I find it really interesting just looking back at that and what's happened, because the left, as we understand the left, would not exist without the contribution of Jewish people. The 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. I mean, since as well, but just in terms of laying the foundations of what the left is, and it's internationalism. And a lot of the reason for that, I mean, I've just put look, I'm not trying to goisplain here. Just setting some context for you to talk in detail to this. Is you have a Jewish diaspora, which in each country, which knows that when you get a surge in reactionary nationalism, that's going to put Jewish people at risk. Yeah. And it did. We saw that, in France, the Dreyfus affair, for example, for those who don't know, about a French colonel who was Jewish, who was accused of sedition, and it was all it was nonsense. It sparked this whole wave of anti-Semitism. But there was always this sense of, this is why, at the time, anti-Semites fed off this. They the Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy. They're rootless cosmopolitans. They don't have loyalty to their country, and there was that sense that internationalism was bred because of that sense of, well, we know what reactionary nationalism, we know we've suffered the consequences. Where Zionism says, no, the problem is not that. The problem is we don't have our own reactionary ethno-nationalism of our own, that we need to be them. And that is just, I mean, it's that kind of tried to crush that Jewish tradition. I'm just trying to interest what you think about that.
Yeah, the Zionist movement was a fringe movement in the United States, in the UK, in Germany, and France, and throughout all of Eastern Europe, the Russian Empire, Poland, Lithuania, Czechoslovakia. It was a fringe movement for precisely the reason you just stated, because the Zionists were ideological allies of the anti-Semites. They shared the same underlying philosophy about the world, which is that the world is divided up into nations. Those nations are blood nations, right? They share certain, not just ethnic characteristics, cultural characteristics, but bloodlines. They have a common bloodline. mean, this is why Arthur Rupin didn't want Jews to marry non-Jews, right? Because the non-Jews would infiltrate Jewish blood and taint Jewish blood. Jabotinsky took that attitude also with some Jews, took that attitude with Ethiopian Jews. They didn't want Ethiopian Jews to migrate to Palestine because they would taint Jewish blood. I mean, by the way, in the early Zionist period, there was a very small number of Yemeni Jews that migrated to Palestine in the 1880s and 1890s. And the Ashkenazi Jews from Europe forced those Yemenite Jews to establish little camp encampments on the outside, actually physically outside of the Jewish settlements in Palestine. So they wouldn't be tainted by the backwards culture of those Yemenite Jews. I mean, Zionism had this kind of eugenicist racial logic to it. And that's why they had so much in common with the anti-Semites in Europe. I mean, that's why all the major Nazi ideologues, Alfred Rosenberg, for example, were raging Zionists, right? The Nazis shared that same ideology of blood and race, and the way you build a strong nation is by ensuring its racial purity.
Blood and soul nationalism. I mean, just finally, do you think? I mean, I found it really striking how, we can see, particularly in the US, because Israel and the US both have Jewish populations of similar sizes. And there's a kind of growing schism between the two, because obviously in Israel we have genocidal mania, and the settler colonialism has whipped up to a particular logical extreme. But in the United States, I mean, if we look at the polling, particularly the younger you get as a Jewish person, the more likely you are to reject not just what Israel's doing, but actually challenge the basic tenets of Zionism. And we saw, like, over a year ago, a poll that showed 40% of Jewish Americans 45 and under thought Israel was committing genocide. I don't know what the latest poll was. That was over a year ago. And, we've seen in New York, we know, Mamdani stood very much on the platform, taking on the genocide. I don't think he'd be the candidate without that as one. It's not the only, obviously, the economic insecurity and so on, but it's a big part of the rise of, I think, the revival, hopefully, of the left. And he's got a big lead amongst, particularly overwhelming lead amongst Jewish Americans. I went to a festival the other week and had, spent it with one of his canvassers, a young Jewish American. What do you think? I mean, that is quite an interesting phenomenon. It's this revival. Do you think there is this revival of a kind of anti-Zionist, non-Zionist Jewish left?
On the eve of October 7, 2023, the largest group of anti-Zionist Jews in the United States was JVP, Jewish Voices for Peace, and they had something like 40,000 emails on their email subscriber list. By December 2023, so this is more than a year and a half ago, that number rose from about 40,000 to 350,000. Now, I don't know the number, what the number is today, but is it 500,000 or a million? Maybe it's way more than that. But you're talking about hockey stick-like growth in the number of Jews who were woken up by Israel's mass murder campaign in Gaza. They were woken up. They didn't, and I could cite you countless anecdotes, countless examples of friends and colleagues who have been woken up as well. So, and then on top of all that, I mean, the number of Jewish anti-Zionists who before October 7th were either creating content but not Jewish content, or not anti-Zionist Jewish content. Whereas now, those same content creators are talking a lot about Judaism, they're talking a lot about Zionism, they're talking a lot about Israel, and they're talking a lot about their own Jewish anti-Zionism. I mean, in the piece, I list off about 30, 40 names. Yeah. You're talking about a Cambrian explosion of Jewish anti-Zionist content creation. You're talking about new minions in places like New York and New Jersey popping up. These are anti-Zionist, Jewish anti-Zionist minions that are popping up once or twice a month. This would have been unheard of before October 7th. You're talking about new institutes, the Critical Study for Zionism hosting its workshops. You're talking about new courses, like Making Mentions facilitates anti-Zionist Jewish activities. I mean, you're talking about new conferences. We had a Jewish anti-Zionist Congress in Vienna, Australia, with hundreds of attendees. I was there a few months ago. You're talking about basically, I think, a complete refashioning of the American Jewish community. And ultimately, I don't think the existing institutions are redeemable. I'm sorry. They've been complicit in genocide for too long. And they stood by Israel for too long. They continue to wave the Israeli flag. They continue to they continue to say prayers for not just the state of Israel, but the soldiers of the state of Israel in synagogue every week. I mean, I'm sorry, you've lost the script. We're going to rebuild with new institutions, new synagogues, new organizations, and we're going to completely rebuild American Jewish life.
Very exciting. And I can see, it's happening. Britain has a much smaller Jewish community, but you can see it here as well. You can see it in other countries in the West and beyond. And I think you're playing a very big part of that. I know lots of young Jews who become politicized look to your work and the work of others, and it's having a huge, huge impact. Something I think you should be very, very proud of. And it's been such an honor to have you. And just for everyone watching, do share the video, press like, subscribe, leave comments. That's good for the algorithm. Then more people listen. That's the whole point. But honestly, it's always such a pleasure. You're just full of insight, wisdom, moral clarity, my favorite two words. So as ever, thank you.
Feeling is very mutual, Owen. Thank you so much for all your incredible work as well.
Bless you, buddy.